There is many a rich stone laid up in the bowels of the earth, many a fair pearl laid up in the bosom of the sea, that never was seen nor ever shall be. Joseph Hall. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me this week. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, and if this is your first time joining me, welcome again, and I hope you enjoy. Now, this week, we will talk about the rest of Southeast Asia. Of course, last week we covered the border regions to the west and north of Southeast Asia and modern-day Myanmar/Burma, and then this week we'll be talking about places in the modern-day countries of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, a little bit of Malaysia, the mainland part. Then we'll see how fast I can dig into this to kind of get to those places. It is, of course, the Memorial Day weekend here in the U.S. I am not doing anything, thankfully. I am just hanging around my house and just resting. It's been a stressful week at my real-life job. So, thank you for joining me, and we'll go ahead and start this episode. So, last week, again, I talked about how the geographic features that separated Southeast Asia from South Asia and East Asia worked, and then I also mentioned a couple of internal features that drew people into and helped kind of define life inside the region. I'll be mentioning a few more of those, but most of this week's episode is focusing on the humans that are living in the region. So, most of the geographic stuff this week will be just mentioned in passing. We'll dive back more into that kind of stuff later when we return to talk about more developing, centralized cities and civilizations. But for now, though, I'm going to try and give a firmer idea of who is living in this region between 8,000 and 6,000 BC, BCE, instead of talking more about, like, theoretically where modern groups came from, which I know I did a little bit of that last week. So this week we're going to try and just keep it focused on mainly the people living there now. And thankfully, I have some very new DNA evidence to talk about on that front. This was something that was done in February of last year. In fact, it was so new. When I did my episode, this was February of last year. We were only 2 or 3 episodes in to the podcast. We were still talking about the origins of leatherworking. So this is something, I didn't even pull up when I was talking about the peopling of the world in Southeast Asia. So this is very new to me. But first, let's talk about kind of overarching, progression of humans in this area. So we talked about how India was one of the first big attractions for humans outside of Africa or all of South Asia. Of course, there were groups that remained in the Middle East, but they were probably focused mainly around the coast. And then moved north a little bit later. And, of course, following along the coast, they were able to reach South Asia and then eventually Australia very quickly after leaving. Within, I think, 10,000 years, I think is the current time frame that we have record of. And then, of course, on their way to Australia, they would have crossed again from South Asia to Southeast Asia. And again, when this is happening, the environment is very different. The sea levels are lower. It's easier to go across these kind of the southern boundaries of Southeast Asia. It was probably not nearly as forested as the interior is. And these people probably would have been very comfortable around, kind of the sea and the coasts. We can kind of guess that because, again, they got to the Andaman Islands fairly quickly, and then, of course, they went through what is now modern-day Malaysia, Singapore, and then got to, of course, Indonesia and those places, and then ended up in Australia. And while the sea level was, of course, lower, and these places were, a lot more, or a lot less, I guess, littoral in nature might be the best term for it. There weren't quite as many islands, and there was bigger, I guess, plains to kind of live on. But there were still, water journeys that would have to be made by boat. But again, that's kind of getting more into the Australian side of things, which again, that's going to be for a future episode. But the people who are moving along the coast at this time, they are, of course, related to modern day Aboriginals in Australia, and of course the Andamanese, and there are, of course, the people in Malaysia known as the Negritos, which is the Spanish word for little black people. That's what they're called. They still don't have a better terminology for that, so please, just be aware. So, who was living in, I guess, the interior of Southeast Asia at this time? And who were they related to? Were they related closer to people living in East Asia? Were they related closer to a different group in South Asia? Or were they related to the people who had initially come through and then moved on to Australia or the Sahul, supercontinent, before the water levels rose and overtook it? Well, this is a paper from, let's see, it's Tobias Gallner, Maximilian Lorena, Wibuhu Kutanan, Helmut Lucas, Martin Fielder, and Helmut Schachel, I believe is how you pronounce that. And if not, I do apologize for butchering those pronunciations. But this was released in Genome Biology and Evolution, Volume 14, Issue 4, on April 2022. But it was initially published in February of that year. They had published that paper independently, and then, of course, it got picked up by the journal, which is something that happens fairly regularly. So, they had found a few human remains in what is, I believe, now Thailand. No, excuse me. Two sets of human remains. One was found in Laos, and the other was found in Malaysia. Now, these remains are from after what we're focusing on. They are from, the one found in Laos was from around 5800, 5900 BC. The one found in Malaysia is from a couple of thousand years after that, around 2500 BC, give or take. But they did DNA evidence, compared them to each other, and compared them to some modern-day populations. And what they found was that these remains are related to the Andamanese people, but they are not descended from the Andamanese. They have a shared ancestor, but they are more than likely, I guess, siblings or cousins. They came from the same initial human stock, and then they diverged from each other. And this happened probably sometime between, I believe it was 40,000 and 45,000 years ago. And they were related to, at least some level, all of the modern populations of what is now Thailand, with the exception of the Chinese. More or less, of course, there are some Chinese who have since intermarried with the Thai or the Lao or the Vietnamese or the Cambodian, whichever ethnic group is in whatever region, of course. So they would be related, but only through that. They are not related to the ancient East Asians. The ancient East Asians will eventually move into the region and intermix with this prehistoric population. Now, for what this population is called, that is a matter of some debate. I think in general, most of the term, or the most common term used for this, this culture, for lack of a better term, because again, there is always a debate if, cultures are their tools at this point, or, are they just using the same techniques to make it due to material that is available where they live. That's always one of those big sticking points for archaeologists and anthropologists and that kind of thing. But I'm rambling, so again, the name is sometimes referred to as Hoabinhian, excuse me, and that is a term derived from the Hao Bin culture, or the Vietnamese Van Hao Bin. And this was first used by, I believe, the French archaeologist Madeleine Colani. She was very famous. She spent a lot of time in the Far East, working in French territory there. And that's something that had developed over time. She discovered these caves in what is now, again, Vietnam. But at the time, I believe, was just considered part of French Indochina as a whole. And this culture, for lack of a better term, again, is kind of characterized as existing between, and this is, again, a matter of some debate, but somewhere between around 12,000 to some places as late as, the 2500s or the 2000s BC, depending on your definition and depending on where you're talking about. And this was a very widespread, tool assemblage group. They were partial to flaked and cobble artifacts. And initially, I think they also used it to kind of consider that this was this large super ethnic group in the region. But I guess that has kind of gone away because, again, there's not much evidence. We run into the problem that we had in what is now like East India and Bangladesh, where because of the environment, it's hard to find a lot of human remains that are easily testable. But we have found, of course, some things. So it is a little difficult to kind of pinpoint these groups in specifics. But what we have kind of suggests that this was a very widespread group. They would have covered all of what is now Southeast Asia, and that includes parts of the islands as well. So at the very least, this know-how and creation of tools was known for quite a while and in quite far away areas. Now, Vietnam, you begin to see a lot more regional variations, and that, the Hoabinhian is kind of being replaced at around our period our time starts. You have a couple of cultures that show up. One is known as the Baksan, and again, apologies for pronunciation. This is probably like a regional variation. of the Hoabinhian. Maybe not like a true tool culture, but they did change up how they grounded up a lot of their cobble artifacts. So they were kind of probably specialists in that, in with that specific material. But they are a very short-lived subculture, I guess. They only last for around 2,000 years, and they are beginning to disappear right at the beginning of our timeline. Now that leads us to the Kunya Van culture, and that is kind of a specific site in what is now Vietnam. And unfortunately, I could not find any sources about this in English. There's some very detailed sources in Vietnamese, but it was just not possible to translate it because there's some stuff that is specifically region based. It's not giving usable translations to English, unfortunately. But so that is what it is, unfortunately. I'll try to get some more detailed translations, or see if hopefully that the research will be translated to English at some point. But until then, we'll just have to leave it there, and then if more information comes to light, I can always go back and correct stuff or kind of fill things out. Again, that is eventually going to be a goal, like as new stuff comes out, to talk about these older places, or these older periods, I suppose, because we're still going to be going back and forth between these regions regularly. So if any new information becomes available, I will gladly elaborate on it and include it. For now, though, let's talk about some other Hoabinhian sites that are not necessarily in what is Vietnam, some of these wider spread regions. So let's return, I guess, a bit to the west and talk about Thailand. Now, Thailand has a few different sites that can kind of be traced to the Hoabinhian culture, and one of those is known as Spirit Cave. Now, this is not far from the Myanmar-Burmese border, at least in the modern day. But it is in use for quite a period of time. I think there's some evidence that people have been using this for at least since 20,000 BCE. And I believe it continues use all the way until around 6,500 BCE. So it's a site that is well used by people who are using the Hoabinhian method to make tools. That might be the best way to think of it. And this is also one of those places where you can begin to see possibly these internal Southeast Asian groups begin to practice a kind of generic form of horticulture or animal domestication. Just these beginning stirrings. There is evidence, though it is very disputed, that certain varieties of plants even began their domestication here. Now, again, this is very disputed. The way that smaller things work, they can sometimes shift layers and go deeper. You'll see this a lot with like small animal bones. But it's been suggested that perhaps cucumbers, or at least a variety of cucumbers, were first domesticated by these people. There's also a kind of bean. Bottle gourds have been found here. Some types of chestnuts and things like that. And these are type of things, some of these would not even be full meals, that these would just be types of dietary enhancements, flavoring, just something, you'd add into what you're actually eating. Also, I believe that this is a region that sees the earliest set of pottery of use in Southeast Asia. And this is probably something that they were, if they didn't come up with their own, it was definitely something they were probably trading with groups to the north. And that would eventually move into the region. But this site is located kind of at the headwaters of the Salween River. And this is a very, very long river. It's over 30... I believe it's over 30 miles long, like north to south. And it's very high up. Like the elevation here is over 2,000 feet, which is like 650 meters, I believe is what I wrote down in my notes. My handwriting's terrible, by the way, so sometimes even I can't read it. But, so these people were probably coming up to the highlands to get materials for tools. They'd, of course, do a little hunting and gathering. And then, of course, as time went by and they had everything they would need in terms of material, they would probably follow the river along, just, clear out areas and then wait for, nature to take its course and for them to move back in. So this is a very good region to practice that kind of proto-horticulture. You leave seeds behind, more seeds than would normally be found in the region. Then you'd come back, later, and then, there would be more crops than you had initially found. It's a very easy process to do. So that's a site in in Thailand. Now, let's talk about places to the east of that. So between the Hoabinhian Caves and Spirit Cave, we have sites in what is now Cambodia. This is Long Spian, or Laong Spian. And again, I do apologize if I am butchering your languages. Do not hate me. I am trying my best. Now, Hoabinhian does not show up here until around 9,000 BCE, which is a little bit later than, what we have for other regions. But it appears that Cambodia was not occupied in any real settlement until this period. It may not have been the most welcoming environment. People could have, just been traveling through to get to the rivers and just leaving the region. But this is the oldest site that human or Homo sapien remains have been found in Cambodia. Now, again, due to the environment, might not be true at all. There could have been plenty of humans living here. We just don't have any record of it. But the cave here is actually still being excavated. It was initially excavated during 1965 to 1970. However, as you may be aware, there were some serious internal disputes, to say nothing of external problems that the Cambodians were dealing with after that period that has kind of prevented large-scale excavation and study. And the country is still recovering from those issues. So there is still a current effort. It began again, I believe, in 2010, 2011. but it's a slow process, and they are being very, very careful. So excavations have been very slow, but they are making progress, and they are trying to get to this Hoabinhian period. They only have some stuff from a little bit later. So, unfortunately, right now, we don't have a whole lot to go on in terms of, specifics. Again, there's a lot of translation issues with getting that material in English. Now, there are a few other places that I can mention that are in mainland Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, there is the Perak it's the Lingong Valley in, I think it's like a region or state known as Perak in Malaysia. And this is where you will find there's a lot of good cave and rock shelters, and there is art that can be definitively dated to that period. And it's nothing crazy, it's nothing too elaborate. It's very much in line with what you would see in some of those other early cave paintings in Southeast Asia. So there's not been a whole lot of artistic development, but it's still very detailed. It's still very traditional art. But these people will remain in the region. These hunter-gatherers, there are still groups that are direct descendants from these hunter-gatherers, though they have had some intermarriage with the agricultural sedentary groups. I believe the gentleman I mentioned earlier that was DNA tested and found in Malaysia, he is actually related to the Manek people. They are one of these Negrito groups. He is I don't think he's necessarily a direct descendant of the individual they found, but he has a lot of genetic overlap with him. But even the Manek have around 30% or so, give or take, of their DNA has admixture from the East Asian peoples who will set up more centralized states and introduce things like rice cultivation to the region. They are also, of course, the Manek also have certain levels of Neanderthal DNA, as well as some small levels of Denisovan, although I don't think they fully mapped this region's branch of the Denisovan, so they can't say exactly how much, but there is definitely some level of ancestry. Also, I believe the Samang people are also related to the individual they found in Malaysia as well. Also, I don't know why, but I was making it sound like they tested just one guy, that's Mani, with the DNA of the man they found in Malaysia. That was weird. No, they tested several different groups, and I made it sound like the ancestor was just one guy being tested against one guy. No, strike that. That was my fault. I didn't explain that properly. Now, in terms of population, so the modern day, I guess, descendants of this individual, the Manek and the Samang, they're very small in number. I believe the Manek have only around a couple hundred people still left. Now, that's not to say that they're the only descendants of this individual left, or this individual's people. Again, there has been certain levels of admixture and intermarriage, and just forcible interbreeding through slavery and things like that. Mostly done by the sedentary societies, but it wouldn't surprise me if the hunter-gatherers occasionally took their own prisoners and things like that. Now, the Samang people, they're a little bit different situation. They are across both Thailand and Malaysia. Thailand, again, you're looking at very small numbers. Malaysia, you're looking at a couple of thousand. But there's a lot of different ethnic groups in Malaysia. There's a large portion, or excuse me, a very large diverse population in Malaysia. This is due to the number of islands and how certain groups are able to kind of isolate themselves, either intentionally or unintentionally. So this is just something to keep in mind. But again, this kind of interactions and conflict between sedentary and semi-sedentary or non-sedentary societies, this is something, again, we're going to have to dive into very in depth, and a lot of different regions have their own stories, but they all kind of rhyme together in certain ways or in certain scenarios. So I'm not going to get too much into their modern day descendants because, again, these people, while they're certainly descended from these individuals, they have had a lot of interactions and they've evolved very differently and developed differently as well. But if you were to look at these people, you would definitely not consider them, for the most part, you probably wouldn't think, if you looked at these people, that you were thinking, oh, these people are from Southeast Asia. No, you might expect them to be from maybe an Aboriginal group in Australia or perhaps somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. So, there is definitely going to be a story of racial animus and conflict between these hunter-gatherers and these sedentary societies as they develop, not just in different, conflict's not just about lifestyles, it's not just about, different, religious, it's also, there's a lot of components that cause this, but, unfortunately there aren't a whole lot of these people remaining. Although I do believe that the Samang, I believe their population has been increasing since Malaysia became an independent country. So, they're fighting back, and hopefully the Mani can as well. Although, who knows? I guess. Sorry to end this on such a down note, but yeah, that's just kind of one of those things that come up in history. So, I think this is a good period to call it, or a good time to call it for, I guess, mainland Southeast Asia. So, just to summarize, we have the Hoabinhian culture, which is very widespread and is, in some places, beginning to see regional developments that are different from, I guess, what may be considered the core heartland of the Hoabinhian, which we don't know where that is. It's associated with Vietnam because of the name, but it could have very easily arisen somewhere in Thailand or Burma or maybe even Malaysia. Who knows? So that is something to keep in mind. And they are closely related to the Adamanese. They are not related to the people to the north or to the east. I'm sorry. Yes, they're not related to the people to the north. This is kind of a different branch. They are kind of descended from the people who first came into India, but again, this was that probably broke off at least 60,000 years ago. So there's been a lot of development between both those groups. And of course, the people who went to Australia also have kind of developed differently as well. So their closest relatives are the Adamanese. Eventually, we talked about it a little bit in the last episode, towards the end of this time period, maybe a little bit afterwards, you're going to see more and more migrations down from the north and the northwest, from the Tibetan Plateau, from China, or what is now China, the Shan Hills and all that. And these people will eventually absorb and intermarry and drive out these hunter-gatherer groups and take land suitable for agriculture. They'll, of course, take tribute, taxes, things like that. And that will be kind of probably a focus on the next time we return to this region. Although, again, the numbers, and this are debatable. Hopefully there will be some more papers published or translated into English that'll help me out with this. So, yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this episode. I know it was kind of a downer, kind of got a little heady there at the end. We will be talking about, I guess, the islands of Southeast Asia next time. And then we will move up to East Asia as well. Although I might need to do maybe the islands of Southeast Asia, the islands of East Asia, things like Taiwan and the Philippines, and then go from there back to the mainland. I'll think about it. I'll let you guys know. But yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. Please feel free to send me any feedback or questions or criticisms, constructive criticisms, preferably. You can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can also direct message me via Twitter. You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel. I will find it there. Any video, you can comment on any of them. All of them are up. We're now posting there at the same time as we release our episodes live. And if I screwed up the time frame for some of that DNA testing, please keep in mind, again, I am a decently educated layman on the subject. I read a lot about it, but sometimes the dates still screw me up because they don't use the standard dating system. They don't use BC or BCE. They use what's known as before present in a lot of situations, and it's before present plus or minus. In some cases it's it's 1,000 years, or 500 years, or 100 years. So some of that is maybe me being a little off with my math, which is not a strong suit at all. So I do apologize if I got that wrong, but I can confidently say that 99% of what I talked about does fall within our period of time that we're discussing. So, yeah. Thank you all. I hope you have a good Memorial Day weekend if you are here in the U.S. And if you are not, then I hope you have a good, normal day and week wherever you are. And I know I do have a few international listeners. Thank you. But yeah, I hope everyone has a great day and week. Thank you all. Goodbye.